Planet Institute.
Welcome back to R&D Unplugged, a podcast from the Learning Planet Institute dedicated to discussing with researchers on the impact of their work in a simple way. My name is Annalena. Today's guest is Gaston Saux. He has a PhD in psychology from the University of Buenos Aires, and he currently works as a researcher within Argentina's National Scientific and Technical Research Council. Welcome, Gaston.
Hi, Annalena. Thank you for this invitation. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you here in our podcast today. Your research is focusing on the cognitive strategies people use when reading, not in young children who are still learning, but actually in adults who have already automated the process and are navigating abundant, heterogeneous information on the internet. I think we all know that. So before we dive deeper into this, let me ask the following maybe less conventional question. If your research had a theme song, what would it be and why?
I like that question. But can I choose two songs?
Absolutely.
Because, there are so many options.
Yes.
So I would first go with a song called En la ciudad de la furia, in the city of fury, by an Argentinian rock band called Soda Stereo. And I like that song because it captures well the feeling of navigating through a complex space. In the song, that space is the city of Buenos Aires. In my research, it would be a metaphor for the internet. The song talks about this space being so large that it's easy to get the impression of being fragmented, that space, but at the same time, it's so appealing that we all want to just go and dive in. And if you see the papers in the area I research, which is digital reading, you very often in the first paragraph see that researchers describe the internet pretty much like that, like a messy space, but a very interesting and seductive space. And if I could complement that with another song, I would go with Once in a Lifetime by Talking Heads.
You may find yourself living in a shotgun shack, and you may find yourself in another part of the world.
I like that song because it's very ironic. It talks about suddenly realizing that you've been living in autopilot and you start questioning your daily decisions and routines. And a part of my research is about how we deal with this duality with which we approach digital information daily, sometimes in more automatic fashion and others more reflexively or analytically.
Thank you for both songs. I always love when our international guests bring also some international songs I didn't know yet. So thank you so much for that. I like what you said about questioning everyday routines and choices, because we're surrounded by so many things in our daily lives, and actually stay critical with that and analytical. I think this is so important. So let me ask you, what inspired you to actually pursue this particular research topic?
Well, it was definitely a combination of my curiosity and how things unfolded for me because, well, my degree is in psychology. And right from the beginning, I felt drawn to the big questions of the discipline, like how the mind drives behavior. But at the same time, it was very important. It was crucial, I would say, the people I met along the way, because when I was an undergraduate student, I started collaborating with a research team that worked on text comprehension. And to me, that was my starting point as a researcher. Definitely not the formal starting point because I was an undergraduate, but it was the symbolic starting point because I learned a lot. And many of the things I learned there and the methods and the topics still feel relevant to me. And then the same happened a few years later. I had a postdoctoral contract here in France in CNRS Research Center associated to the University of Poitiers. And again, I met another group of researchers, which, well, I'm happy to call my friends now. We still collaborate. And I learned a lot. And I kept studying reading. I already did that and researching that topic, but much more focused on specific reading contexts like the internet that are information saturated. And at least to the reader, they're not fully structured. So the decisions we make as readers and what to read, how to read, and when to stop reading are important to explain what we are understanding and what we do with the information that we've acquired afterwards. So yeah, I would definitely say it was a combination of what I felt I wanted to do with my career, with my education in psychology. But this was very general, it was very unspecific. And then it was about the people I met.
You said how to delecture information from the internet. When do we stop? Where do we continue? I think this is such a relevant topic at the moment, as we are all doing this daily on the internet, on our browsers, on our social media apps. It's just all around. So how does your research actually contribute to the issues that the world is facing at the moment?
Well, I mean, as you just said, we're all dealing with huge amounts of information that also varies greatly in reliability. And this is particularly evident in digital environments. My research focuses on how we evaluate and integrate sources under those circumstances. So information source. Ultimately, it's about how humans interact with complex information ecosystems. So if I think about the contribution, going back to your question, I would say the idea is that a better understanding of the cognitive mechanisms that underlie this phenomena would help to support better ways to our daily decision-making, both at the individual level, for example, when someone's looking for health information and whatever information finds on the web will then affect the decisions regarding the well-being and health of this person, but also at the institutional level, because there will be educators and education managers and maybe people, it's at the policy-making level, that will be interested sometimes in intervening on these strategies that readers have when they read on the internet to potentiate or promote certain ways of reading.
And how does this field or your research was actually touched or changed by the outcome of AI? How does this integrate actually in this research? Because it's a pressing challenge we have at the moment.
Yeah, everyone's talking about AI. Well, it does change certain things because it was this massive sort of infusion of AI in the way we consult digital information. But I would say in the basics about what I study is really the cognitive and epistemic strategies that people use when they approach thoughtfully to information. I think these strategies and skills remain stable across several technological changes, including AI. This is important because sometimes in these areas, digital reading or digital skills in general, we go and we're always after the rapid technological change. We can never, because the moment scientific research, education systems absorb a change, there's a new technology. And we're always behind.
We're always late.
And I think that instead of trying to focus on the rapid fact-checking tricks on how to solve that or how to learn the full affordances of the new surprising technology, we should concentrate on these cognitive and epistemic abilities that will remain relevant across those changes. But it's definitely, I have a research on AI. I'm preparing the paper because if you work on these topics, you cannot avoid questioning or trying to understand how people interact with this technology.
So it's actually more kind of a fundamental research in that area because it's really about the basics, the methodologies, and this can be adapted to anything. Right now it's AI, the big upcoming, but who knows what's next.
Right.
But it can be actually adapted because it's really about the reading competency.
Right. I mean, the questions that you have about AI right now, and actually I was on a conference last week and they had done a sort of a historical documentation. They were very similar that with massification with Google on the motor search results, people were asking themselves, we won't think anymore because now with a click, we have a lot of information available and answers to our questions. I'm not saying it's the same, but I do think there are some things that have to do with how we establish some information is reliable that remain across this stable or relevant. And that's what ultimately I try to identify so that then we can design interventions or applications that work as pedagogical tools to promote a certain type of reading, a more critical type of reading. And that won't be like old information or an old intervention next year because, the general AI will come and overcome the generative AI or something like that.
So it's actually about the critical literacy just in general and how can we foster that in education so that the young people are actually prepared for any kind of situation, for the unknown. Who knows what's next? You already mentioned general AI, so we don't actually know what's coming after.
Right. Well, a good example, for example, is corroboration. Corroboration is a strategy that it's been identified for a long time. And with AI, it becomes very relevant because with some synthetic media, you will get sort of a summary of multiple sources, and you're not necessarily aware of which are those sources or how this technology have integrated them, because you're not part of that process anymore. But you can still corroborate, so go out of the audience response if you have any reasonable doubt and surf through different documents and corroborate that information. It's a very old strategy, but it's relevant. It's still relevant now.
Yeah, and it will be probably. So I think the importance becomes really, really clear through these examples. Now, what I'm interested in, what were some of the key findings or insights from your research? And did also maybe some results surprise you or challenge existing assumptions?
Yeah, well, surprise always, because people always behave differently than my initial predictions.
Yeah, that's research.
That's research in human behavior. But, well, interesting results. One interesting result is related to the role of contradictions and discrepancies in this type of critical reading. Because when we as readers detect a contradiction between, let's say, two documents we're reading about the same topic, it doesn't feel good. It's not nice to not fully understand what we are trying to understand. But what we have found, and this is something that has been already established before I started studying, but with our research team, we sort of helped extending some results and theoretical assumptions, is that in certain circumstances, contradictions and discrepancies can be a good way to develop a more critical stance to what you're reading. We have, for example, eye tracking data, which is how the eyes move when you read, that show that when people detect discrepancies, they will fixate more on the sources. So who's saying that information? And at least the assumption is that is a more proficient way of reading, because you're not just focused on the content, but also on where it's coming from. And we also have data from after reading. People's memory about who said what is better after detecting discrepancies or contradictions in what they read than didn't detect them. And they also include more information about the sources when we ask them to explain as what you just read. And if there were contradictions, they will start integrating each statement to where it came from, as opposed to when everything's coherent at the beginning, they just make sort of a mush summary of everything they've read that may include very different perspectives that should be better tagged to their sources. Another interesting result is that getting people to pay attention to sources, it's only the starting point. There's a lot of interventions that put the accent into what's called, this is a technical term, but it's called the epistemic vigilance of the readers, which means, being more alert and cautious about what you're reading because you may be deceived in some way. And what we found is that, of course, this is important. You need people to pay attention to sources and sort of be vigilant. But this is only the starting point, because then the criteria that people use is to evaluate whether a source is reliable or not varies enormously among people. So what is a reliable source for a person may be a very unreliable source to another person.
Can you give an example there?
Yeah, we did a study with a PhD student that he wanted to compare reliable sources and unreliable sources. So we first did a preliminary study, which is a kind of study you do to establish that what you're doing is how your participants will then perceive it. And we had everything okay. It's called the manipulation of the reliability of the source. And we passed to the main study, and the results didn't work, but we had additional data and we could compare that it didn't work because what the participants in the preliminary study had established was reliable and reliable was not what the participants in the main study were thinking was reliable or unreliable. I think we can think of public figures that sometimes we ask ourselves, but why do people believe what this person is saying? And it's because they are assessing this source as reliable, but maybe they are using different criteria than others. So that's another interesting result. Interventions should not be just about telling people to pay attention to sources. You need also an analytical approach. You need to establish which criteria or dimensions are relevant and how you are going to present them to someone so that that person will eventually or hopefully adopt those criteria when reasoning about the ability of source. And I think the schools should be the place to teach that, but it's very complicated because I don't think every school does that. And when it is done, my impression is that students feel sort of a detachment between what they learn in school and how they should evaluate the reliability of the information they found on the internet. Because the thing is, we learn to assess reliability on the internet, navigating the internet, not on the schools with their teachers. So if a teacher comes and tells you should evaluate in this way, I don't know, I think there is something there to think about and design when planning interventions so that this detachment does not act as an obstacle for this kind of promotions of critical reading coming from formal education.
Well, that also was my first thought when you described it. I think it's important to practice this early on, so I would actually expect it to start in school so that it's a reflex they actually get when evaluating this information. But yeah, I can imagine it's also difficult to really integrate it into the daily exercises, the daily practices you do as a teacher. Do you have a recommendation or an idea, or did something came across your research that can be easily maybe or less easily somehow integrated into everyday teaching?
One thing we did and in one intervention study was varying the modality of intervention. So we had the expert instructor intervention that was a teacher, the traditional teacher-led intervention. And then we compared that with a peer-led intervention. So the intervention was the same. It was the same protocol. The same things were presented to the participants. But the person that was leading the intervention was different. In one case, it was a student like them. And in the other case, it was a graduated teacher that acted as an expert, telling them what they should do, telling the participants what they should do. And there were some differences between the peer-led and the instructor-led modalities of the same intervention.
That's interesting.
The peer-led intervention had a stronger effect. So both interventions were effective, but in research, the size of the effect is how much of the data is explained by the effect you found. And it was larger for the peer-led intervention.
Okay, so actually letting the peers helping each explaining things.
Yeah, sort of reducing the social distance between who's explaining you how to evaluate reliability on internet and yourself. Because young people are amazing what they can do with new technologies, but we cannot expect them to develop spontaneously cognitive epistemic skills. In a way, we need to teach them, or at least be with them and see how they're doing it and share our criteria with them. So I think it is important to sort of resolve if there is an obstacle there between who's teaching these critical thought skills and who's learning them. Well, we should really talk about it and try to see if we can reduce that obstacle or gap.
Before we go deeper actually into the practical application of your research, I would have one last question about the contradictions, because you mentioned that this actually makes a more critical stand. But when I think about using now a generative AI tool and I ask a question and it gives me a really convincing answer, actually, there's no contradiction in it. I'm always afraid that students actually take this as the big truth directly and they don't even question it anymore because there's no contradiction in it. They don't have a conflict there, I have the impression. So you mentioned you already, of course, working on something also AI regarding, do you have any results there already? What does it do to the critical literacy?
Yeah, we have the results, but I have not analyzed them.
Okay.
One thing is having the results and the other thing is sitting and going into statistician mode and deciding your statistical modes. We haven't done that.
Okay.
But it's actually, it's a study in which the AI produced text has a contradiction or is different to other texts that define a certain construct, theoretical construct. And we wanted to see how much participants would take into consideration this contradictory text, knowing that it comes from AI or not knowing that there are different comparison groups. But yeah, I understand totally what you say, because the plausibility is one big aspect of these algorithms with which we interact as if they were humans. And it's funny because you get the perfect answer and you say, no, but what you're saying is wrong. And then it says, no, you're right, I was wrong, and now this is right.
But you have to know that he was actually wrong.
Yeah,
and
right.
It starts there, I guess.
No, totally. And what you say has total sense, because I would say there are two different ways of reading. There is one way of reading which is the easiest way, and there's the other way of reading which is the critical way, there's a lot of evidence, and we know this is not the way in which we all approach to written information on a daily basis. We normally assume a lot of things. We take them for given. And with the internet, there are a lot of pragmatic cues that are not present in written information at all. So right now we're talking face to face, and there's a lot of pragmatic cues, so situation cues from the situation or the context we're in, that will regulate our comprehension and also the trust that we have in this conversation. When you read written information, a lot of those pragmatic cues are absent. They're not there. And furthermore, in the digital environments, sometimes those cues are obscured intentionally. So you really need to approach, it really depends on your goal, your reading goal. If you're just reading to buy something in the supermarket, maybe you don't need to have a critical stance. But when you're reading to inform yourself on the internet, you need to be aware that it's not like reading a book. You have a different, and the context is different, and therefore you need a critical stance towards what you're reading. But it's not easy to get there because it's cognitively, it's costly. We don't like to do that kind of reading.
Exhausting.
It's more exhausting, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, thank you for going into this further, because I think it's something a lot of teachers, also educators, are questioning these things, because we're facing it every day in our classroom. So thank you for that. We already talked a bit about bridging actually research in real life, but I would like to ask the question again. So how do you make the bridge between your research and real life application? And maybe do you have any anecdote or story where your research directly impacted or maybe even changed someone's life?
That's a big question.
Definitely.
At its core, my research is based on a fundamental goal, that is understanding how we make sense out of written information. But in the later years, this basic goal has fed a more applied goal, which is developing and testing educational interventions to promote critical reading. We've talked about some of those studies just right now. And I think that's the most evident connection or bridge between my research and real life. But, there's still a big step missing, which I have not done yet in my research, which is once you have proven an intervention works, there's still the translation phase. That is that what you have produced is taken or absorbed by the actual social actors, the ones that are in the field. For example, if it's an education intervention, well, the educators should take that and adopt it. And that also requires a series of actions and steps called the translation process. That's something I have not worked personally as a researcher yet. And about changing someone's life, well, I wouldn't say I changed someone's life forever. At least I don't have the data to say that. But there's been definitely some moments. For example, one of the interventions to promote source evaluation, critical source evaluation, we went a year after, and in a totally detached academic task. This was with undergraduate university, first year, second year university students. They had to do an academic task in which they had to recommend some sites to inform yourself about a certain topic. They would choose the topic they want. And then we compared what they were recommending as sites to inform other people about the topic they were interested in. And the ones that the year before had passed by the intervention were still using those parameters, or at least the sites they recommended had those parameters in an explicit way as compared to the control group, which is the group that did not do the intervention. And that felt very well. It was a rewarding moment because indeed you felt like you've created an impact on someone.
But I think this is already, for me, this was always huge. If just one student in my classroom actually took something from what I was teaching or trying to bring across, I think that's already success. That's already impact.
Absolutely. And, they don't even realize, but when they tell you, when you're teaching and someone tells you, oh, thank you for saying that, or thank you for this class, I really enjoyed it. It really, I think it's, in the case of teaching is about that. It's about sharing with someone knowledge so that that knowledge changes other people.
Yeah. And just, I think, what they're doing of things. So I think that's the most rewarding part of actually being an educator. You mentioned the translation of interventions into actually the real room, the real classroom, or the real learning sessions. Are there any materials that actually educators could use already? Do you have something like that? Or do you know of places where educators could find that?
Well, it's not ready yet. We're actually not right now with the, I coordinate a small team back in Buenos Aires, down under, I should say. It's not Australia, but we're actually southern than Australia. So we're more down under. So with this group, we're writing a book that presents this same intervention I was talking to you about, that we observed an effect a year later. And the idea is that this book is meant not for researchers, but for anyone who wants to learn about this intervention. It's a very simple intervention. It's very focused on critical source evaluation. It's not something that 6 months and you should incorporate into the school. It can just be a workshop, And, we hope that this book will sort of broaden the audience of what we have to offer. And then, it's different, but right now also there's a big project. It has to do with translation, but not necessarily with tools related to critical source evaluation. There's a big project that's starting right now, again, in Argentina, that is the result of an association between CONICET, which is the scientific system in Argentina. That's where I come into play in this partnership. And there is a private company that's, it's willing to fund the project. And then there are 3 Argentine provinces, which would be the equivalent of a French region, I believe, because they're big geopolitical units. And we are starting a program that's more focused on initial literacy, so developing fluency and text comprehension, but in kids and their teachers as well. Actually, the teachers of the teachers. And that includes also the production of a lot of materials. But again, it's starting. We have green light, but we haven't started.
That's already
yet,
great.
So I can't give you like a link for the materials that, it would be in Spanish, of course.
Okay, but yeah, maybe in the future, because I think there are always, in a lot of fields, a good amount of actually innovations, but it's hard to share it with others. There's so many great ideas out there, done by teachers already on the ground. So I'm happy if you have anything shared with us, so we can also send it through our social media channels. I think it's just important to share what's there.
Yeah,
and if it's based in research, that's the best.
It's the hardest part, to build that bridge you were asking about. Yeah. And this podcast is also an effort. It's a bridge, science, communication, psychom. It's also a bridge between the world of the researchers and the scientists and people who are interested in that, but will not necessarily devote their life to research.
Yeah, no, not everyone wants to do that.
Oh, no, that's just like 5% max.
So let me come to my last question of today's episode. Let's pretend I'm 20 years old and I want to change the world for the better. Why should I engage in research, first? And second, why should I choose your research topic?
Research is not the easiest career path because it requires many years of training. So the first thing I would say to this imaginary young person is start now. If you think research is something that interests you, don't wait to have a degree. Start collaborating with a researcher group right now. And I would also tell this person that, research is a cool job because it has many of the attributes that are used to describe 21st century jobs. Like research scientists have been working like that for many years now. It requires questioning assumptions and thinking creatively and adapting constantly and moving through very different kind of activities. Like you have to, one day you're reading theory and the next day you're analyzing your data, which is a totally different mindset. And then you have to go into sort of the traditional Greek academia mode and talk with your colleagues and convince them about whatever you found. And you have to keep your mind open because people will observe your work and will ask you or propose you alternative ways of interpreting your. And that's the way you also learn. So I would say to this young person that if you like being methodic like a detective, because rigor is also important to learn how to test your ideas systematically and based on evidence. But you also like being creative and constantly sort of challenged and keeping your mind active, then research is a good path for you. But why they should choose my line of research or the topics I research, I wouldn't know. The answer is because you like it. At the beginning when you asked me, how did I get to the point where I am right now? I said, there was something, I can't explain how, but I felt drawn to this area of knowledge. And it doesn't mean you're born with that interest. You can certainly build it by interacting with the researchers and knowing how the problem is being studied, or which are the questions that the researchers are doing about a certain area that maybe you didn't know much. But you have to develop that personal interest. You cannot fake out. You can't work your whole life researching a topic you're not interested in.
No, you have to be passionate about it.
Yeah.
Because there are also moments that get really hard and you need the passion to go through that.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe can you reflect, my last question, to get something, the motivation for this research topic, because I find it's just so relevant in the current time, and I think it will just continue being that. What's the significance of this kind of research on this topic, and maybe its implications on youth right now?
Well, I would say the most important implication, to say it simply, is that, to me, justification of knowledge based solely on personal criteria, like this sounds logic to me, or this is consistent with my prior beliefs, is totally overrated right now. And exposure to different perspectives, when approached thoughtfully, is a good way to develop our critical thinking. I think that's the most important implication.
Well, thank you so much. That actually wraps up today's episode of the R&D Unplugged podcast. I'm Annalena, your host. A huge thank you to our guest Gaston Saux for sharing his valuable insights with us, and also a big thank you to all our listeners out there who joined us for today's episode. Thank you so much, Gaston, for being here today.
Thank you, Annalena.
R&D Unplugged is a Learning Planet Institute podcast. This episode was produced by Annalena Neurohr and Shahab Nastar, with recording by Edouard Picard and editing by Jean-Marc Sauvin. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. You can find all of our podcasts and further information about all our activities, like always, on our website at learningplanetinstitute.org/podcasts. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Learning Planet Institute.